Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video.
Thanks for watching. Follow a brighter destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
Word. You came all the way out here in that truck just to tell me it can't be fixed, didn't you? Word. I hadn't even opened the hood yet. She said it before I'd said a single word, arms crossed over an $800 jacket, standing in a gravel driveway in the hills above Asheville, North Carolina at 11 minutes past 9 in the morning. Word. The specialist in Charlotte had it for 5 weeks. 5 weeks, and he sent it back worse than he found it. Word. So tell me, Mr. Cade, what exactly are you going to do in an afternoon that a certified shop couldn't do in 5 weeks? Word. She laughed short and dry and glanced sideways at the man beside her in the charcoal gray sweater, the kind that costs more than most people's rent. Word. Fix my father's car and I'll marry you on the spot. God knows nobody else can. The man in the sweater smiled with his teeth and nothing else. Word. I didn't answer her. I walked past all 3 of them and lifted the engine cover myself. And for 11 seconds I said nothing at all because I knew this engine. Word. I had built part of it with my own 2 hands 9 years earlier in a shop that doesn't exist anymore, standing beside a man who is dead now. Word. And the woman laughing behind me had no idea what she just spoke to. I let the cover fall shut most of the way and turned around, and I think that's the exact moment she stopped laughing, though she couldn't have told you why. Word. She wouldn't be laughing much at all in the weeks that followed, but I didn't know that yet either. My name is Jonah Cade. Word. I'm 38 years old. I run a 2-bay garage off Haywood Road that specializes in cars other people have already given up on. Word. I'm a widower. I have a 9-year-old son named Micah, and that morning, standing in a grease-stained work shirt beside a 14-year-old service truck, I was a woman, like Vivian Ashford, assumed I was right up until I opened her hood. The call had come the evening before, a 1973 Corsair Talon GT Silver Blue dead for 14 months, a misfire that came and went. Word. A drop in oil pressure after any drive longer than an hour. 2 shops had already pulled that engine apart completely, found nothing, put it back together, and watched the same fault return within 90 miles. Word. That last detail is the only reason I climbed in the truck. A car that runs clean for 80 miles and then stumbles isn't a broken part. Word. It's 2 things that no longer agree with each other, and you don't find that with a scanner. You find it with your hands, and only if you've been inside that kind of engine before. Word. Before I left the shop, I took a small brass disc out of the tin on my workbench and slid it into my chest pocket. Word. It was the size of a poker chip, heavier than it looked, one edge worn smooth from years of thumbs. Word. 4 words were stamped into its face. My son saw me pick it up. Can I hold it, Dad? I handed it to him. Word. He turned it over, mouthed the word slowly, and gave it back. Are you fixing a real fancy car today? Word. A very fancy car, I told him. He nodded like that settled something important and went off to find his backpack. Word. I didn't say any of what was really running through my head out loud. That morning I was still just the mechanic in the driveway. Word. But to understand what stopped me cold for those 11 seconds, you need to know whose hands had been inside that engine before mine ever were. Word. The Ashford Estate garage held 7 cars, and every one of them cost more than my building. The Talon sat in the far bay, a color somewhere between gunmetal and dust. Low-eyed and mean in the way only cars from that era managed to be. Word. You're welcome to look, the man in the sweater said, stepping in beside me. His name, I'd learn in a moment, was Preston Vance. Word. But I'll save you some time. Charlotte had it on a lift for over a month. Nobody in this state knows these cars better. Word. Then it's strange they handed it back broken, I said. He smiled, but the smile didn't make it past his mouth. Word. Intermittent faults are like that sometimes. There's simply nothing to find. There's always something to find, I said. People just give up looking before they find it. Word. I walked toward the car before he could answer, because that's a habit Walt gave me. Meet the car first. Word. The people can wait. The car will not lie to you. I put my flat palm on the rear deck the way you'd rest a hand on a horse, so it knows where you are. Word. And when the cover came up, and the marriage joke was still hanging stupid in the air, here's what stopped me cold. Word. 1 thing at a time. First was the fan aluminum with a reinforcing rib no factory part ever wore. Word. Second was the oil line routing, threaded away from the exhaust heat along a path that took real understanding to design, not a manual to follow. Word. Third was a small bracket low on the left side, half hidden behind a bundle of wiring. I pulled a pen light from my shirt pocket and put the beam on it. Word. There was a mark stamped into the lower edge, buried under a film of old oil. Wiped it once slowly with a clean rag. Word. WB07. I didn't say the mark out loud. I didn't trust my own voice with it yet. Walt Brennan. Word. The seventh engine he ever built entirely with his own hands off the books for a car he'd rebuilt from a rusted shell. He made only a handful in his whole life, and everyone carried his stamp and a number, given to no one who hadn't earned the right to stand at his bench while he worked. I had handed him wrenches for this exact engine. I'd heard it turn over for the first time on a cold morning when I was 26, and I still remember the sound. Walt taught me one thing above every other thing he ever said. Start the engine, he'd tell me, and don't listen with your ears. Listen with your feet. The ears want to be impressed. The body doesn't know how to lie. I thought for years he only meant engines. He met my wife exactly once before she passed and told me flat out not to be a fool about her. He was right about that too. Dana's been gone 3 years now. Micah was 6. That's all I'll say about it, except that after she died, the work was the only floor that stayed steady under either of us.
Did you find something?
Vivian asked, coming up on me without a sound. Up close, she was younger than her voice, and tired around the eyes in a way good money and a good haircut couldn't quite cover. When did your father buy this car? I asked. About 9 years ago. Bought it already restored, through a broker. Why does that matter? Because someone's been inside this engine in the last 14 months, I said, and they replaced a part that should never have been touched. That mismatch is causing your misfire and your pressure loss. The car runs clean until heat pushes the new piece out of alignment with the old work. That happens right around 80 to 100 miles. The man in the gray sweater shifted his weight, just slightly. Most people wouldn't have caught it. I did. 3 shops missed that, he said. The dealership missed it too, I said, but you can see it in 11 seconds if you know what you're looking at. They were diagnosing a modern sports car. This isn't one. It's got hand-built work on it that appears in no factory manual anywhere. This is Preston Vance, Vivian said. He manages my family's trust, has since before my father passed. Preston put out his hand and I shook it. His grip was warm, firm, and told me absolutely nothing, which is its own kind of tell. A man whose handshake gives you nothing has practiced giving you nothing. 3 working days, I told them. I'd rather not move it. Why not? Preston asked. Because a car like this doesn't like being trailered, and because I'd rather work where I sit than trust it out of my sight. Something passed across his face when I said that. There, then gone. At the time, I read it as a man who didn't like being told no in his employer's own garage. I'd understand it very differently before the month was out. Here is fine, Vivian said. That night, after Micah was asleep, I did the kind of digging a mechanic isn't supposed to know how to do. Vivian's family trust managed money for other wealthy families, which meant it filed disclosures, and buried in one of them was a schedule of assets pledged as collateral against the trust's credit lines. The Talon was carried at $391,000. I read that number 3 times. A documented, verified F-1973 TAT-GT with Walt Brennan's hand on the build sheet brings between $2 and $3 million at serious auction. His name alone adds close to $500,000 on top. This car had been written down on the trust's own books by nearly $2 million. There are exactly 2 ways that happens. Either somebody didn't know what they had, or somebody knew precisely what they had and needed it to look like less, so it could be bought out cheap and sold later for what it was actually worth. And whoever had pulled Walt Brennan's original work off that engine hadn't done it to save a repair bill. They'd done it to erase the one thing that made the car worth millions. You don't accidentally remove the part that proves what you own. I closed the laptop and sat a long while in the dark kitchen. Somewhere out there was a person who had opened this exact engine, understood completely what he was looking at, and quietly siphoned off $2 million of a dead man's work. And in the morning, I was going to make the invisible problem loud. I was going to make the car run again. Which meant that by tomorrow evening, I'd be standing directly between that person and the one thing he wanted most. I just didn't know yet who he was or how far he'd go. Next morning, I called the one man alive who could confirm what I'd seen. Frank Cassidy had been Walt's crew chief for close to 30 years. He's 72 now, retired 20 minutes outside Asheville, and he still answers the phone like you've interrupted something important. Kate, you only call when you want something. I want something, I told him. WB07. Do you remember which car that went in? The line went quiet a moment. When he spoke again, the irritation was gone. Why are you asking me that? Because I had my hand on it yesterday, I said. A Talon GT in Weaverville, owned by a family named Ashford. Frank set something down, slow and careful. That's the one, he said. Walt did the last full rebuild the fall before he got sick. You were there for most of it. He sold it right after, through a broker, to help pay for his last stretch of treatment. Went to a collector back east. That's all I ever heard. The collector's name was Ashford, I said. His daughter owns it now. Word, she has no idea about any of this. No, he said, I'd guess she doesn't. He was quiet another moment. Word. Jonah, you remember Walt logged every engine he ever built by hand in his own books. After asses with Marge loaned them to a museum archive down in Georgia for a permanent exhibit. Word. But they're still hers. I felt the whole thing land before he even finished the sentence. Frank, if that logbook names the original part and it's dated from the year Walt did that rebuild, there's a record of the truth nobody can touch. Word. Slowly catching up to me, he said. Written and dated and locked away years before you ever heard the name Ashford. Word. Can Marge pull a scan of it? She can. Why do you need it? I looked out the kitchen window at the flat gray morning light. Word. Because I think I'm going to need to prove a dead man's work existed after somebody went to a great deal of trouble to make sure it looked like it never had. Word. Take care of that boy of yours, Frank said and hung up. He always hangs up first. I drove back up to the Ashford estate the next day, both to finish the job and to find out for certain what hadn't been done to the car. Word. A young man in clean coveralls was waiting in the garage, maybe 24, who introduced himself as Dylan and said he looked after the estate's daily drivers. Word. You can stay, I told him. You might learn something. This engine was built by the best there ever was. Word. Over the next 4 hours, I took the oil system apart one fitting at a time, and I talked him through it the way Walt once talked me through it. Word. Feel that, I said, and put his hand on the return line. Now here, I moved his hand to the scavenge fitting. Word. On a normal car, these two lines don't much care about each other. On this one, they're married. The man who built this made them depend on each other on purpose, because depend done right is stronger than either part alone. Word. How do you know that was on purpose, he asked. Maybe it just ended up that way. Because I watched him do it, I said, without looking up. Word. A long time ago, when I wasn't much older than you think you are, Dylan was quiet after that. Then he handed me the next tool before I asked for it, which is the first real thing a good one learns to do. Word. I found what I was looking for a little before noon. The part carrying Walt's original design was gone. In its place sat a modern aftermarket unit, well-made, expensive, and completely wrong for the car. Word. It didn't just fail to help. It actively fought the original engineering, like forcing the right key into the wrong lock until something bends. Word. Is that bad? Dylan asked. It looks new. It is new, I said. That's the problem. A careless man leaves the old part alone because he doesn't understand what it is. Word. Whoever did this understood it perfectly. I turned the new part over, looking for its serial stamp. Someone had taken a grinder to it. Word. The number started, then stopped halfway, ground down to bare metal. You don't do that to a part you're proud of installing. Word. You do that to a part you don't want anyone tracing back to who paid for it. Dylan glanced toward the main house and dropped his voice. 14 months ago, he said, the last time this car actually left the property. Mr. Vance didn't send it through us. He took it out himself on a trailer, told everybody it was going to a specialist, told us not to log it anywhere. It was gone about a week, came back running worse, first and only time that's happened with any car here. I wrote down exactly what he'd said, word for word, and had him sign and date the page. He didn't ask why. I think he already knew. A logbook 200 miles away could prove the original part had existed, but a young man in clean coveralls could prove that the only week the car had ever left the estate belonged, start to finish, to the man in the gray sweater. I photographed everything, every angle, every stamped number, the timestamp burned into each frame. Vivian came out, once with a coffee mug, and stood at the edge of the bay. You've been at this since 8, she said. Dylan tells me you haven't stopped. I'm documenting it, I told her. Before I take anything else apart, I want a full record of what was here when I started. Why does that matter? Because if something turns up missing later, I want to be able to prove it wasn't me. She studied me over the rim of her mug. That's an unusual thing for a mechanic to worry about. It's an unusual car, I said. She almost said something else. Then she didn't. The correct period original part took 2 days to source from a man in Phoenix who keeps a private stock of things that stopped being made before I was born. I installed it on the morning of the 3rd day. The fit against the WB07 bracket was exactly what it should have been. Clean, snug, right. Then I drove the car 41 miles up the parkway, and I didn't baby it, because you can't diagnose a car you're afraid of. At mile 11, the old engine found its voice, low and hard and certain, a machine with nothing left to prove and knowing it. At mile 83, right where the fault used to arrive without fail, there was nothing, no misfire, no slow bleed off the gauge. Just a 50-year-old machine doing exactly what a dead man built it to do. I felt it through the soles of my boots the way Walt taught me to. It felt like the truth. When I brought the car back, Vivian was waiting on the gravel. She held out her hand for the keys and drove it herself, gone almost half an hour. Word. When she returned, she sat there a moment before getting out, both hands still on the wheel, like a person who just remembered something she thought she'd lost for good. Word. It hasn't run like that since my father was alive, she said. It was always in there. It was just being stopped. Word. What do I owe you? She asked. 2,600, I said. 3 days and the part. I want to pay you 10,000. Word. I told her. I quoted 2,600, and that's what the work was worth. It won't change what the work was worth. Word. The work tells the truth, I said, even when the people around it don't. She looked at me a long moment after that. Word. I reached into my chest pocket, passed the brass disc between my fingers, and set a business card on the workbench instead. Word. Neil Foster, a lawyer down in Asheville. I want you to call him. Why would I call a lawyer? She asked. Word. About a related matter, I said. He'll explain it better than I can. What did you find in my car, Mr. Word. Cade. I'm not the right person to walk you through it, I told her. Neil is. She put the card in her jacket pocket, and I drove home thinking the hard part was already finished. Word. It hadn't even started yet. That evening I picked Micah up, Mrs. Alvarez down the hall, and we made spaghetti, the one thing we both know how to make well. Word. He set the table with the wooden fork and spoon Dana bought before he was even born, because that's a rule in our house I didn't write and won't break. Word. Did you fix the fancy car? He asked. I did. Was it silvery blue? How did you know that? I asked. Word. He shrugged the way he does when the answer is obvious to a 9-year-old, and beneath explaining, he got up, went to my jacket by the door, and came back holding the brass disc. Word. He does this. He likes the weight of it. Read it to me, I said. He turned it toward the light and read the 4 words slow and careful. Word. What does it mean? He asked. It means you do a thing right, even when nobody's watching to check whether you did, I told him. Word. Even the fancy car, especially the fancy car. Did the lady look? I think she did, I said. I think she forgot she liked it, and then she remembered. Word. That's sad, he said. Why? Because she had it the whole time, he said, like it was nothing, the way kids say the truest things without noticing, and went back to his dinner. Word. I didn't know, watching him do that a man I'd already met would say my son's name out loud in my own shop before that season was over. Word. If I had known, I don't think I'd have finished eating. Vivian called Neil Foster the next day and said nothing to Preston about it. Word. But Neil needed the trust's internal valuation records to move forward, and only the trustee could produce them fast, so Vivian asked casually, like routine. Word. Preston did not relax at the word routine. He heard a daughter who had never once, in 9 years, asked to see those records, suddenly asking, days after a mechanic had spent 3 days alone with the one asset that could give the whole thing away. Word. He didn't panic. He got there first. I wasn't in the room, but I've pieced it together since. He caught her at the end of a long day, which is when a careful man plants a careful seed. Word. I want to talk to you about the mechanic, he said, not to alarm you, just to put a thought in your head. Word. A man who turns down $10,000 isn't turning down money. He's buying something more expensive than money. He's buying your trust. Word. And a man only buys trust for one reason. You're reaching, she said. Perhaps, he told her. But the car was fine for years, and then it spent 3 days alone with a stranger in a camera, and now there's a lawyer's card in your pocket that a stranger put there himself. Word. I'm only asking you to be careful. That's my whole job, to be careful with your families when you're too trusting to be. Word. He never once said the word con. He let her assemble it herself, which is worse, because then it's her own idea. Word. Then came his real move, wearing the face of concern. The car was a liability now, with a stranger's fingerprints all over its history. Word. The responsible thing was to have it appraised and moved somewhere secure. For her own protection, he had the Talon on a transport truck and gone before the week was out. Word. I found out when I called the estate to arrange a follow-up drive. Mr. Cade, a woman named Claire, said, and paused just long enough that I could hear her deciding how to phrase it. Word. I'm afraid your services won't be needed any further. Is something wrong with the car? I asked. I really can't say, she said. Word. Miss Ashford asked that any further contact go through Mr. Vance. I'm sorry, Mr. Cade. And she hung up before I could ask what exactly she was sorry for. Word. I stood in my shop with the phone still against my ear after the line had gone dead. The car was gone. Word. The one piece of evidence I could put a hand on sat behind a door I couldn't open, in the custody of the one man with every reason to make it disappear. Word. And the woman I'd tried to help had just been told by the man she'd trusted since she was a girl in a school uniform that I was the actual threat. Word. That's the thing about being underestimated. It cuts both ways. Nobody believed a mechanic could see in 11 seconds what 3 professional shops had missed. Word. And nobody stopped to check when a polished man in an expensive sweater called that same mechanic a thief. The low opinion that made her marriage joke feel safe in April was the exact same low opinion that made his accusation feel safe to believe now. Word. I sat in my shop that night, afraid not for myself, but for the fact that I'd pointed a woman straight at a dangerous man and then handed him every tool he needed to cut me out. And then I remembered what Frank had said, and I understood Preston had made exactly one mistake. Did Marge send the scan? I asked him. Better, he said. She still has the physical book in her own hands. When she loaned those books to the archive, they logged everyone in on arrival. There's an intake date, a registrar's signature, a reference number. That book with your signature in it and Walt's notes naming the exact part now missing has been sitting inside an institution in Georgia for 6 straight years. Preston had built his entire story on one assumption, that the only record of what belonged in that engine lived inside my own head, and in a notebook I could have forged on any slow afternoon. Take the car, discredit the man, and the truth would have nowhere left to stand. He had no idea the truth had been sitting in a climate-controlled room in Savannah the whole time, stamped, dated, signed by strangers who had never once met me. In the one place that Preston Vance, for all his excess and polish, could never reach in and touch, I didn't call Vivian to defend myself. A man defending himself sounds exactly like a man with something to defend, so instead I called Neil Foster and told him about the archive. This changes which way the fear runs, he said. An independent archive proving the original part existed, dated years before you ever saw the car, means the part had to come off during the one window Preston controlled access. Moving the car wasn't caution, it was hiding evidence, but none of it lands, Neil said, unless she chooses to believe it. He has 30 years of her trust. You have a date stamp on a book she's never heard of, so we're not going to send her a document. We're going to put you in a room. Her conference room had glass on 3 sides, the mountains falling away below it. Vivian sat at the head of the table. Preston sat at her right hand, jacket open, a man among allies in a room he'd sat in 100 times. I sat across from him with Neil beside me, one thin folder unopened on the table. Preston tells me you spent 3 days alone with a car that's been in my family for nearly a decade, Vivian said, that it has problems now it never had before you arrived, that you refused my money in a way designed to make me trust you. He says there's a name for what you are, so before this goes another inch, tell me why all of that is wrong. I didn't tell her why it was wrong. I opened the folder and slid 1 page across. A scan of Walt Brennan's logbook, the work order for her car, my signature on the apprentice line, Walt's notes naming the original part dated to the fall he did the rebuild. Preston glanced at it and laughed, small and patient. A handwritten notebook, he said. He could have written that last Tuesday. Vivian, this is exactly the kind of manufactured evidence I was trying to warn you about. I slid the 2nd page across. The archive's intake record. The date the logbook was accepted. The registrar's signature, a reference number. The notebook isn't the evidence, I said. The date is. That book has been locked in an institution in Georgia, in the custody of strangers, since long before I ever heard your family's name. I slid a 3rd page across, a statement signed by Dylan, describing the single week in 14 months the car had ever left the property, who had taken it, who had ordered the crew not to log it. The logbook proves the part existed, I said. The truth is the car went missing exactly once, under exactly one man's control. And the part that replaced it had that serial number ground off, which people only do to parts they don't want anyone tracing back to who paid for them. The room changed. You could feel it, the way you feel weather shift before you see it. Preston kept talking. Archives lose things. The mechanic could have arranged anything, planted anything, paid anyone off. But the air had gone out of the words, and he heard it himself. Turned away from me, toward her, and dropped his voice into the register of an old family friend. Vivian, I held your hand at your father's funeral. You've known me since you were a girl in a school uniform. You met this man 4 days ago in your own driveway. Who are you going to believe? She didn't answer right away. She looked down at the 3 pages, my signature, a dead man's handwriting, the archive's date stamp, her own mechanic's initials. She took her time, and Preston made the mistake of letting the silence sit because he thought it was working for him. Then she lifted her eyes and looked at him instead of me. The part you say never existed is drawn in this man's logbook from a year before my father even bought the car, she said. It's named in Walt Brennan's own handwriting. That book has been locked 200 miles from here for 6 years, and my own estate crew will say, under oath, that this car left the property exactly once since my father died. God, I'm in your custody, and came back wrong. So I have one question, Preston, and I'd like you to answer it right here. If Jonah Cade invented all of this to rob me, how did he plant evidence in a Georgia archive years before he ever saw my car, get my own staff to corroborate his story, and grind the serial off a part he had no reason to touch? Preston opened his mouth, then he closed it. For once in his life, he had nothing to say. Vivian, he finally said. Just her name. You're not going to answer it, she said. It wasn't a question. 4 days, she said. You keep saying I met him 4 days ago as though that makes him a stranger and you a fixture. Word. But 4 days is exactly how long it took a total stranger to find something 30 years of trust never found. Word. Get the car back, she told Neil, not him. Have it here by tomorrow morning. After that, it stopped being my fight and became the work of people who do this for a living. Word. A forensic accountant went into the trust's full fare records, and the car turned out to be the smallest part of it. Word. Assets marked down on paper. Entities Preston quietly controlled, buying them back at a discount, then reselling at true value through a chain nobody had bothered to trace. Word. The car had only ever been a rehearsal. The real theft ran 8 figures deep, running since before her father was cold in the ground. Word. She didn't shout when she understood the scale of it. She didn't cry. She asked her lawyers one question, not how much, not how, but when. Word. And when they told her since when, she stopped being a woman who'd been robbed and became a woman who'd been lied to by the last person her father had ever trusted. Word. Those are not the same wound. They told her she could recover the money quietly and keep it civil. She was the one who said no. Word. She wanted it referred to federal prosecutors. That's when 3 other names came forward once trust records started to unravel. Word. An elderly widow in Hendersonville who'd trusted Preston with her late husband's retirement fund and watched it quietly shrink under fees she was told were standard. Word. A young vineyard owner near Boone whose family land had been used as collateral for a loan she never authorized. Word. A retired physician in Charlotte who'd handed Preston power of attorney during a health scare found, and 2 years later, 3 properties sold without his knowledge. The proceeds routed through an account with his own name misspelled on it, just enough to make it deniable. Word. Each one, once they understood the pattern, agreed to give sworn statements. Preston felt the floor going, and a man who feels the floor going never waits patiently for the fall. Word. He came looking for the last loose thread. He came to my shop on a Tuesday morning. Micah was at school and Mrs. Alvarez had an appointment. I heard the bell over the door and didn't look up right away, because I had a torque wrench mid-pull. Word. When I finally looked up, Preston stood in the middle of my shop, tan gone, looking like a man who'd spent recent nights awake doing math that kept refusing to come out right. Word. He set a full check on my workbench, squaring the corners with $200,000, he said. Word. In exchange, you stop cooperating. Your memory of Sir Ernest turns out to be less reliable than you thought. I only need the timeline to stretch. Word. Timelines that stretch, I told him, have a way of breaking instead. It's a great deal of money, he said, for a man with a shop and a child and a mortgage on both. Word. The answer's no, I told him. It's a one-time offer. There won't be a second one. Then it ends here, I said. Word. He looked at me a long moment, and I watched his face change into the look of a man who's run out of things to buy and is deciding, right in front of you, which threat is finally going to land. Word. His eyes moved slowly around my shop and drifted to a crayon drawing taped to my tool chest. Micah's drawing. Word. Our building. A silvery blue car parked out front. A boy with a smiling face drawn beside it. He looked at that drawing a moment too long. Your son, he said. His voice didn't rise at all. That was the worst part of it. Micah, he's at Montford Elementary, isn't he? Word. He gets out at 3. Sometimes Mrs. Alvarez runs late, and I'm told he waits by himself on that low stone wall near the flagpole, under the maple tree. Word. Sits there and reads. The shop went completely quiet. Somewhere out on Haywood Road, a truck downshifted and was gone. Word. I set the wrench down gently because I didn't trust myself to do it any other way. I have big hands and a long memory and a great deal to lose. Word. Then I walked around the bench, and I kept walking, and Preston took one step back and another until his shoes found the door frame. Word. I'm only telling you what anyone could observe, he said. Get out of my shop, I said. Right now. He held my eyes one more second, measuring whether there was anything left to gain. Word. There wasn't. He picked the check back up and walked out into the morning without another word. I watched his car go down Haywood Road until it turned. Word. Then I called a detective named Roy Keller, who'd been the local cop before the federal side took over, and told him exactly what Preston had said, which wall, which tree, which child, because a man can call me a thief in a glass conference room and I'll wait him out patiently. Word. But the second he said my son's name out loud describing exactly where Micah sits and reads, Preston Vance stopped being a financial problem and became something the law moves on far faster. Word. Detective Keller had a daughter of his own, he told me later, and there are things a certain kind of man simply cannot unhear. Word. Within a day, 2 quiet people were drinking coffee across from a low stone wall under a maple tree. The threat went into the federal case as witness intimidation, which raised Preston's exposure enormously, and his own attorneys were quietly discussing a plea inside a week. Word. He pleaded guilty that summer. Wire fraud and witness tampering. 38 months in federal custody, restitution of just over $15 million to the trust and its other victims, barred from managing anyone else's money for life, stripped of his role as trustee. I testified at the sentencing when the judge named the threat against my son as the specific reason she sentenced at the very top of the federal range. Preston looked down at the table. A man who'd spent his whole career reading other people's rooms, and at the very end he couldn't lift his eyes to read the one he'd built himself. Something shifted quietly after that, across the wider circle of people who'd known him. The estate crew stopped being told which cars they weren't allowed to log. Two other families he'd managed found smaller versions of the same pattern in their own portfolios, caught early enough to matter. A regional classic car appraisal group started requiring independent, dated documentation on any restoration involving a named builder, specifically because of what happened to one silvery blue Talon in the North Carolina mountains. None of it made headlines. All of it made a difference to somebody. Vivian came to my shop on a Wednesday in the autumn, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. Micah was still at school. It was raining lightly, the season's first rain, and she stood just inside the door shaking it off her coat. Frank arranged this with Marge Brennan, she said. He told me you'd know what it was. I knew before I unwrapped it. The shape of it under the paper was a shape my hands remembered on their own. It was Walt's original logbook. Not the scan that had saved me in that glass room, but the actual book, its leather gone soft at the corners from 30 years of a careful man's hands. I opened it to the work order for her car. My signature sat at the bottom, on the apprentice line, careful and a little too neat. The handwriting of a young man who badly wanted an old man to be proud of him and hadn't yet learned how to ask for that out loud. Below my signature, in Walt's own hand, was a note I'd never seen. Apprentices don't read the master's private notes, and by the time that book left our shop, I was already gone. It said the boy had the hands which you can't teach anyone, and the ear which most men never develop no matter how long they stand at a bench. The only real question left in him, Walt had written, was whether he had the patience, the hardest of the three and always the last to arrive, and that he'd watched the boy long enough that fall to decide he was going to bet on him turning out fine. What does it say? Vivian asked. She hadn't moved from the doorway. I closed the book gently and kept my hand flat on the cover a second, the way Walt used to keep his hand flat on a fender. It says he thought I might turn out all right, I told her. Did you? She asked. I thought about it honestly, because she'd asked it honestly. My wife thought so, I said. My son, I hope, will think so once he's old enough to judge. The rest is harder to be sure about. She nodded like that was a better answer than the easy one would have been. I'm sorry, she said, about the joke back in April. About marrying you. I looked at you in that driveway and thought I knew exactly what you were, right down to the ground. You weren't supposed to know, I told her. That's not what the work is for. There's a restoration collective forming near Blowing Rock, she said. They need someone to lead the shop floor. Frank gave them your name. Then, hand still on the doorframe, something in her decided itself all the way. And I'd like to buy you dinner. You and your son. Not a meeting. Not the job. Just dinner. The three of us somewhere with paper napkins. Where a 9-year-old gets to be exactly 9 years old. In April, I made a joke about you across a garage, and I meant it the way you throw a thing at someone you think is beneath you. This isn't that. This is me asking, as a person, whether you'd let me know the two of you a little off the clock. I'd have to ask Micah, I said. He runs my whole social calendar. Ask him, she said, almost smiling. Tell him there'll be dessert. Then probably yes. She walked back out into the rain, and I watched her car go down Haywood Road until it turned. I didn't know then, and I don't fully know now exactly what that dinner was going to be. Thanks, or an apology, or the first line of something I hadn't yet made room for. But it was a real invitation from a real person, and I just said yes. That was more than April's joke had ever offered anyone. That night, after Micah was finally asleep, I sat in the kitchen with Walt's logbook open on the table and the brass disc beside it. The apartment was quiet in the way it only gets after a child has finally stopped fighting sleep. I picked the disc up, turned it over, and read the 4 words stamped into its face, the 4 words I'd carried in my pocket for close to 9 years. The 4 words Walt stamped into every man he ever finished training. The work tells the truth. She had joked in April about marrying a man she assumed was beneath her in a grudge in front of the people she pays to laugh at her jokes. And the truth of that man had been sitting 8 inches from her own hand the entire time, stamped into an engine by someone who understood exactly what a thing is actually worth. I set the disc down inside the pages of Walt's book, right at the work order where my own signature sat, and closed it gently. I'll give it to Micah when he's older, when he can sit still long enough to hear the whole thing. Word. I'll tell him about a cold shop by a river and a man named Walt Brennan and the difference between loud and strong. Word. And I'll let him decide for himself what those 4 words really mean, because that's the only way anybody ever actually learns them. Word. So here's my question for you, before you go. After she'd laughed at me, doubted me, and let the man in the gray sweater try to throw me out of her life entirely, I could have walked away and let her lose everything. Word. Not one person on this earth would have blamed me for it. Would you have gone back to help her anyway? Word. Tell me what you would have done in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know if this story meant something to you. If it made you look a little differently at the quiet man in the work shirt at the next table over, do 3 things before you go. Word. Hit subscribe so the next story like this one finds you without you having to go looking for it. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. I read every single one. Word. And if you've got 60 seconds, share this with somebody who's ever been underestimated by a room full of people who should have known better. Word. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to a small channel trying to grow one honest story at a time. Word. To glamour. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Word. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. Word. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.